Well, welcome to the Cinnabar. Today we're going to talk about a subject that gunsmiths and gun owners and collectors tend to grapple with. And that's the whole issue surrounding what constitutes a repair versus restoration versus conservation and outright fakery when it comes to vintage firearms. Now, there are a lot of different opinions out there. And I'm going to share with you some of mine and talk a little bit about the market in general. You know, there are things that are acceptable within certain markets for these firearms, and it changes depending on the type of firearm or even the part of the world that the collector may be in. So I brought out a few examples, and these are really in the area that I work, mostly old Winchesters, old Colts, old West type firearms. But we'll talk a little bit about some of the others as well. So let's get started. We'll talk about repairs of vintage firearms. Now, I think we all recognize that originality has a dramatic impact on the collector value of this type of firearm. But I don't think anybody would argue against the fact that any firearm should be kept in a safe working order and repaired if they aren't. Now, say if we've got hammer notches that are all messed up and a sear that's buggered up real bad, and that hammer may or may not stay in the full cock position, that should be repaired. And that's not going to affect the collector value of even high-end collector firearms. But the issue arises when we run into a repair that is going to be seen, that will affect the original finish in some way. And that's what we have to grapple with. Now, take this 1906 Winchester, for example. This one come into the shop missing the magazine tubes, the hangers, the rear sight, and we'll go through our parts and pieces and try to pick out some parts that'll fit on here that look correct for the gun and match the finish that's on it, or I should say lack of finish that's on it. I don't think anybody would say that's the wrong thing to do, and it certainly doesn't affect the value because this doesn't have a lot of collector value. Now, let's say this is a very highly collectible 1890, basically the same configuration as this one, or same kind of gun, but it's a deluxe pistol grip, checkered stock, panel scene engraved, gold washed gun, highly collectible, highly valuable gun. It comes into us with a big dent in the magazine tube that goes clear through into the inner magazine tube. Now, we're either going to have to repair that or replace it. And in order to make that look correct when we're done, we're going to have to try to match the finish to the gun, depending on, if this is a very high percentage of original finish, we're going to rust blue that to look just about like brand new. If it's not, then we're going to try to age that and make it match. And because we're doing a mechanical repair, we're not trying to fake anything. We're just trying to get this gun repaired the way it should be, and a gun like that deserves to be repaired. To my thinking, that shouldn't have a dramatic impact on the value of the gun. Now, if, say, that same gun came in and the buttstock was worn, the checkering was almost worn off, the bluing was all gone off the barrel, and we wanted to have the checkering recut and refinish the stock, rust blue the barrel, that's going to have a pretty dramatic impact on the value of the rifle. And it probably should. The reason that there is such a premium for these very, very high condition and apparently untouched vintage firearms is because there are so few of them out there. If you're going to get the big bucks for one of these firearms, it's because it is in that untouched original condition. Now, here's the reality of that, and this is going to come as a shock to some of you maybe, but a whole lot of those very high condition guns that you see that are apparently untouched aren't. There are a lot of them out there that have had work to them, but by artisans that know their craft, and they are not as untouched as you think they are. The truly untouched originals out there are, the percentage is minuscule. Okay, that's why learning how to spot those things if you're investing in collector grade guns, is extremely critical. And understanding the value of the guns, if you're an owner and having some work done to them, is extremely valuable to you as well, in order to make good informed decisions. Now, the term conservation, as it relates to firearms repair, in the past has always meant something, at least to me, like what occurs in museums where they are cleaning and protecting firearms from further decay, say. But lately, it's really gained in popularity, particularly in the mil-serp portion of firearms collecting, where a fellow by the name of Mark Novak, who many of you probably recognize that name from his YouTube channel, has taken a lot of mil-serps in really rough shape with active rust and stocks that are in really bad shape, and conserved them. Now, these are firearms that don't have real high collector value, and if they're left to their own, they've got active rust and things that really need to be fixed and stop that decay. So, we're talking about guns like this one that came in the other day with a group of guns. Actually, one of our viewers sent this with several other parts guns, just sent them through the mail to give to me to see if I could use them for anything. And here's a perfect example of a gun that we could do a conservation on. In fact, I'm planning to do one, and we'll do an episode on it, where we've got a lot of active surface rust. The stocks really dried out. This thing was probably in a shed somewhere, got moist and dry several times. We can see there's quite a little bit of bright blue underneath all that rust, so we'll see what we can't do. Now, this one, wouldn't justify the cost of a full restoration. You're going to have far more money into a restoration of this firearm than it's ever going to be worth at the end. So this is a perfect example of something that would be a good candidate for conservation. Now, conservation has not gained widespread acceptance in the collector community that collects this type of firearms. And I'm hoping that will change, because I think it very much has a place with firearms like this. Now, here's another example. This 73 came in the other day with some mechanical issues, and we'll get it fixed up, nothing major, but you can see that it's got a replacement barrel that's in the white. It's got the finish completely gone down here on the end of the mag tube, on the fore-end cap here. It's in the white here on both the upper and lower tang. And this is not a collectible gun. It's a gun that belongs to a cowboy action shooter who wants it for competition. The wood's been replaced. It's a 38 caliber barrel on a 44 caliber action. So this is a gun that, of course, we want it to function correctly and safely, but this one really needs some conservation work, and that's what I would consider this. Getting this bare metal, getting some kind of a finish on it to keep it from rusting. It's not rusting now, but it will. And so I would consider this more of a conservation. This gun's never going to have the collector value to justify a full-on restoration again, just like the 1890 there. But it can be conserved, it can be made to look aesthetically pleasing and be in nice condition and function well and be a great competitive shooting gun for this fella for years to come. Now let's talk about the next step, and that's a restoration. Now there's going to be a lot of different opinions about this, but here's mine. If the gun is still in original condition, leave it alone. But if it's been refinished in the past, or it's in terrible condition, has been beat up and neglected, it may be a good candidate to restore. Now, of course, there's various levels of restoration, all the way from the corner gunsmith who's going to sand the stock and buff all the metal parts and throw it in a bluing tank, to a conscientious restorer who's going to rust blue and properly refinish the stocks, all the way to the high-end, make it look brand new, expensive restoration. And I'm going to admit right off the bat that I don't like those high-end restorations. I don't think they look right. I don't think it looks correct to have a 100 to 150-year-old firearm that looks like it came out of the Morocco factory last week. The other part of that is they are so expensive. Rarely does it make any economic sense to shell out the funds for one of those high-end restorations. The value of the rifle probably isn't going to justify it when it's done. It's probably not going to be worth what you pay for the restoration, much less what the value of the rifle was or the gun was before the restoration. Now, we do own one here on the Cinnabar in my personal collection, and I did an episode on this one just recently, but there's a reason we have this one, even though I don't like these high-end restorations, and this was done by a very well-known national restorer. But this is a one-of-a-kind firearm. It's really the only known true pistol grip second model 1895. So we couldn't really wait for another original in original condition because this is the only one. But so this one came out of the Winchester Reference Collection. It spent its whole life in that collection until the 90s when the Cody Firearms Museum sold off some of the collection that they considered excess, and this fell into private hands and unfortunately into the hands of a fella, a very wealthy collector back east who never met a firearm he didn't think could be improved upon, or couldn't be improved upon. Really liked bright shiny things and had money to burn. So this one, while I really doubt it needed a restoration, it got one, and I certainly wish it was still in its original condition. They did a pretty nice job on it, although, you know, if you know what you're looking at, you can see the problems with this restoration. And I paid a fraction of what I'm sure they paid for it to have the restoration done, and a fraction of what it would be worth if it was still in original condition. You know, the other problem with these high-end restorations, if it's a fairly rough firearm when it goes in there, it's really more of a tribute to the original gun, because very few of the original parts are going to come back. You know, if it's been beat up at all, the wood's going to have been replaced, the barrel's going to have been replaced, a whole lot of the other parts are going to be replaced. Very little of it is going to be original. So I just really not a fan of spending all that money to get back something that I would have preferred to see in original condition, or restored to a, how shall we call it, a more aesthetic condition. So anyway, let's talk a little bit more about, I've got some other examples here of guns that may be candidates for some level of restoration, and one or two that maybe should just be left well enough alone. Okay, let's start off with this 1892 Winchester Trapper Carbine 4440. Everything's correct on it. It's early enough. It letters with Cody Firearms Museum. Short barrel, short fore end, the barrel address in front of the band. So it's all right except for the finish. Now, at some point in its life, somebody has removed the original finish and put a type of browning solution on it. And it's not unattractive, but it doesn't look original, especially to the trained eye. They also polished up this lever and kind of rounded the corners on it when they put some case coloring on it. But really, this is a gun that, because it is no longer original, doesn't look right, it would be a good candidate for a restoration, at least a partial restoration. I wouldn't think that this gun would look very good if we did one of those bring it back to looking like brand new kind of restorations. You know, you just don't see trappers in that kind of condition. So this one, I'd probably leave the wood pretty much alone and come back in and put a rust blue on it, maybe age the metal a little bit, introduce some high point wear. We're not trying to make a fake gun by any means, but try to make it look more like it should if it were original, and probably come back and do something with this lever too. Maybe clean it up and recase it and age the case colors, or maybe even replace the lever. But I think this one could be a much more attractive gun, and again, because it is no longer original, it's a good candidate to do that with. Now let's look at the next one I've got here. Another pretty rare gun And this one is actually in original condition. Now, for those of you who watch the channel, you know I'm a partial to 1895s, and this one's a pretty good one. This one's a 405 deluxe checkered with a Winchester rubber butt pad, and so a pretty rare one. There aren't a lot of these out there. Now, this one again is in original condition, but it's just not real attractive. You know, the finish on the wood is kind of darkened. We can't see the pretty grain that's in the wood on this one. The checkering is worn quite a little bit. We can see kind of a mottled appearance on the receiver here, and even down the barrel. The bluing's just not very good. You know, we've got a lot of bluing loss on the finger lever and the magazine. So we could really make this an attractive gun by going in and doing some restoration work. But we're not going to touch it. This is a really good example of a firearm that really just should be left alone. It's in original condition. It's a rare configuration. We're just far better off, in my humble opinion, to leave this gun alone. Now, there may be people out here who would send this in and say, make it look new again, but I just don't think that's a great thing to do there. We're only temporary keepers of these firearms, and when the original finish is lost, it's lost forever. Now, here's another high-end 95 that it doesn't have any finish left, and it really, when I got it years ago, it was just a basket case. This thing had been very badly neglected. It had a homemade sight worked onto it here, made out of key stock and kind of bent around the receiver. This thing has had some really poor storage, and you know, this being a first model pistol grip deluxe is an extremely rare rifle, and this one probably has the highest grade of wood I've ever seen on an 1895. You just don't usually see, even on the deluxe 95s, really high grade wood. I'd say this is at least 3x and probably closer to 4x wood on this thing. So this one, when I got it, it had extra holes down the upper tang here. It had actually, some of this wood had been removed and another hole drilled here for some kind of a sight. There's wood missing off of the comb here, I assume to set that receiver sight down or that tang sight down. Actually has been some grinding, a flat spot on the front of the receiver here, I assume for the sight picture. This side of the receiver has seen terrible storage, and we've got pitting all down this receiver, on this magazine, on the lever. And so this one, while it hasn't been refinished in the past, this is one that's been, you know, I talked a little bit about if they've been modified or in really poor condition. You know, I don't think it would be an issue. I think this deserves to have some kind of refinish work done to it. We need to fix up the tang here a little bit, work on the wood some, get these pits taken out. And if we're going to do those things, then we're going to have to introduce some kind of refinishing. We just can't leave it bare metal here and not do something about refinishing the wood and whatever repairs we do to the tang. So this one, while it hasn't been refinished, is still a great candidate for some form of restoration. And again, this one I wouldn't try to make it look brand new again, but try to make it look like it should. Now, this is one of the reasons that I'm taking on very, very little new work these days, because I've got enough of these projects of my own that I'm not getting to. So don't be offended if you're asking me to work on some of your guns and I'm just not taking everything that comes through the door right now. Now let's talk about collectible firearms that have had work done to them with the intention of making them look like something they aren't, in order to separate you from your hard-earned money. The fakes that are out there. Now, in any high-dollar collectibles, there's going to be people out there willing to fake them to make money. And, you know, firearms isn't immune to that. I've found that the vast majority of people in the firearms world are more than honest, but there are a few frauds out there, and they really stink it up for the rest of us. Now, so if you're going to get into higher end collectible investment grade type firearms, you really need to know what you're looking at, or have access to somebody with real expertise that can see the signs of a faked firearm. Now we've got a couple examples here today. One is not a high-end valuable at all, but a good example of a firearm that's been faked to make it look like something it isn't and something better than what it is. This one I used to think was a really cool little 16-inch 1894 Winchester 30-30. Has U.S. Ordnance mark on it, the bomb stamp here, the U.S. Border Patrol down the barrel here. The only problem with it is it's a total fake. Now, the stamps are all wrong. I've come to realize the Ordnance bomb stamp is the wrong design, the U.S. is wrong, and the U.S. Border Patrol down the barrel is actually off of a U.S. Border Patrol commemorative edition that came out years ago. And if you look really closely, you can see where they mostly ground off the commemorative part of that, where it said U.S. Border Patrol commemorative down the barrel. So this one is just a shooter grade fake parts gun at best. It's just kind of a shame that people are like that. Now we'll talk about one that my wife got taken on early in her collecting of these Colts, and this is a beauty here. Let's take a little closer look at this one. Now we can see that this is a absolutely beautiful first generation Colt single action Army 3840 ivory grips. The only problem is it's been completely refinished, and it's been very, very well done. Now sometimes the difference between a high-end restoration and fraud is just the intent. This one my wife bought from a gentleman. He was a little older, portrayed this as a gun that had been in his family since it was brand new and for generations, and everything about it was absolutely correct and the whole 9 yards, very convincing. And at that time she was still buying some guns over the internet, and the whole thing was just a made-up story. And it turned out then that this particular seller was very unscrupulous and had a history of selling guns like this with the same kind of stories going on. So whoever did this was very good at their work, but if you really know what you're looking at, and as we've become better at spotting some of these things, some of the telltale signs became pretty obvious that this was a refinished gun and not at all what it was portrayed to be. Now what complicates things even further for firearms like this is that the owner who had the work done and the restorer may have had the best intentions in mind when the work was done. They may have just wanted to make the firearm look really nice again. But the problem is, as I mentioned earlier, we're all just temporary custodians of these firearms. This thing may have had 10 owners in the past before it came into our possession, and it's going to have a whole lot more after we're gone. They may or may not know that this isn't the original finish. So you really have to educate yourself on what to look for originality, or worse, to be able to spot something that's been faked intentionally and isn't what it appears to be. So, seek out people with expertise to help you. If you're a Winchester collector, send some pictures onto the Winchester Arms Collectors Association forum. Some of the most experienced collectors in the world are more than happy to help you out with those kind of guns. But don't spend your hard-earned money on stuff that isn't right. Now, it seems to me that, particularly with Old West type firearms, that there's been a real dichotomy in the collectability of these guns, or the desirability of these guns. We've got the purists who basically say if it isn't completely original, untouched, unmolested, the value is not there. And the other side of the spectrum is we'll spend the money to make them look brand new again. But the reality is that nearly all guns are on a spectrum somewhere as far as condition and originality between those two polar opposites. So there's a whole myriad of conditions and so many choices for whatever kind of restoration work is appropriate. And of course, it's your opinion that matters for your gun. So take what information you can get and understand how it affects the value, the expense that will go into it, and the value that it might add or detract, depending on the gun and what you have done to it. So it's a complicated issue, and there are a lot of opinions about it, but what it boils down to is what you think is right for your particular firearm. So I hope I haven't muddied the waters up too much for you. And maybe you've learned something, at least have something to think about. Until next time, happy trails from the Cinnabar.